Welcome to this afternoon's webinar titled Glaciers, Meaning and Mythologies. Today's event is the first of two programs exploring connections between Arctic ice and the arts and humanities. My name is Carol Oja, and I am Faculty Director of the Humanities at the Radcliffe Institute and William Powell Mason Professor of Music and American Studies in the Harvard Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Today's program continues a series of discussions about climate justice and the humanities that began in 2023 with Angelique Kidjo, the global pop star and climate activist. In 2024, we focused on climate fiction for young adults, especially the novels of Octavia Butler. Then in 2025, we turned to the long-range impact of Hurricane Katrina on musicians in New Orleans, including the bounce artist Big Frida and the jazz musician and leader of the Mardi Gras Parade, Big Chief Bo Dallas Jr. All these conversations are part of Radcliffe's 5-year climate change initiative, and recordings of previous programs are available on our website. Today's webinar is the first of a pair focusing on ice and glaciers as explored in the arts, the humanities, and in the interdisciplinary context so crucial to studying climate. These programs probe the cultural, creative, and social dimensions of environmental ice in a time of rapid change and decay. 2025 was the fourth warmest year in U.S. history, as reported widely, causing glaciers and ice sheets to melt much faster than they regrow, with sea levels rising. To bring global attention to this crisis, the UN General Assembly proclaimed 2025 as the International Year of Glacier Preservation. Today's speakers include an environmental historian, a geographer, and a glaciologist, all of whom, in one way or another, have placed ice at the core of their research. Danny Inkpen is an assistant professor at Mount Allison University in New Brunswick, Canada. Her book, Capturing Glaciers, A History of Repeat Photography and Global Warming, explores how the meaning of glacier photographs has shifted over time, addressing the question, what does global warming look like? Jen Rose Smith is an assistant professor at the University of Washington with specialties in Arctic studies and indigenous geographies. An Alaska native, her book is titled Ice Geographies, The Colonial Politics of Race and Indigeneity in the Arctic. In it, she examines ice as a force far from neutral, as she puts it, viewing its impact on surrounding indigenous communities. Today's moderator, Dr. M. Jackson, is a geographer, glaciologist, and science communicator who is a National Geographic Society Explorer and TED Fellow. Her books include Ice to Water, The Ice Sings Back, and The Secret Lives of Glaciers. Full bios of all our speakers are posted on Radcliffe's program webpage. We will also place those links in the chat during today's program. Finally, I want to acknowledge members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public, and we thank you. We also want to gratefully acknowledge the Anson Wright Dean's Leadership Fund, which is supporting this event. We encourage you to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them brief. This will enable the speakers to address as many as possible in the time available. Also, keep an eye on the chat to register for the second in this two-part series. Titled Inspired by Ice, that program takes place on Monday, February 2nd, with a composer and art historian discussing their work in relation to glaciers. It is now my pleasure to hand the virtual floor to Dr. M. Jackson.
Thank you so much, Carol. And it is just wonderful to be here and have this glacier conversation with Danny and Jen. I really loved reading the promotions for this event. And an environmental historian, a geographer, and a glaciologist, they walk into a Zoom room or a glacier, right? I have so much to learn because we're having this interdisciplinary conversation. We're coming from such different backgrounds. And so, Jen and Danny, thank you for joining us. Let's just get right to it, okay? For the audience here, please do submit questions, but I'm going to start with one of my own. Um, Jen and Danny, for over a decade, I have worked in partnership with Niheimer, which is a research station that studies glaciers on the south coast of Iceland. And we have a running joke that we know which other scientists from all over the world have come and researched the glaciers we research. We know that because we read their papers later. The joke being that they don't ever come into the research station and check in. They just come and potentially replicate our work or do different work and then they publish it later. So my question to you, from your perspective, what are some changes? What are some structural changes within funding and authorship and field practices, institutional norms that are necessary to create meaningful collaboration amongst scholars like this? Jen and Danny, either of you.
Would you like to address the question first, Jen, or would you like me
No,
to?
please go for it.
Okay, I will give some thought to this. Thank you. And this is a great question, and it's a very interesting one coming from your experience at the research station. I think that, figuring out precisely what in the funding structures and the sort of the gigantic infrastructure of earth sciences can be changed is beyond my pay grade. But I do have some thoughts about sort of ground up changes that we're already seeing and that I think are really laudable. So um, for me, what I think is the sort of most important thing that we as glacier researchers can do to combat this kind of extractive, sometimes sort of salvage mentality research when it comes to glaciers is to really emphasize the process over the product. And my thinking about this has been shaped by the work of people like Max Lieberon, who is doing a sort of anti-colonial pollution science approach at their lab at Memorial University in Newfoundland. And then also in my experience working with some really fantastic folks in the Canadian Mount Assessment a few years ago. So in that project, there were natural scientists, there were humanists, there were social scientists, there were sort of like lay knowledge holders, guides, and folks who work in the mountains. And then there was a whole host of Indigenous knowledge holders who were intentionally sort of brought to the project from the ground up, and we tried to do the work in a way that cultivated good relations, and that really did that was intentional about the values informing the work, and placed the emphasis on doing the process well, with the understanding that sometimes that takes time and sometimes you have to get creative and think of new ways to appropriately share knowledge. And we developed a variety of ways in which to do so, some of which you can see if you look at the mountain assessment on the University of Calgary Press's website. So when Indigenous knowledge holders shared their knowledge in an oral storytelling capacity, rather than sort of reduce that down to text, we have QR codes that you can click on, and then you hear them tell the stories in their own voices, right? That took effort, that took time, that took thinking, but it was coming from a place of trying to do the work in a way that made, that opens it up in a truly collaborative and respectful way. And I know that, this kind of work does push up and come up against a lot of the funding structures and the ways in which scientific knowledge is validated. But I think that is one of the most important ways in which we can push against a culture of, like you sort of described, just diving in, extracting, and then it's the concomitant siloing that comes with that. So just very briefly, that's sort of my first thought on this question, that I have some experience imperfectly, but with good intentions, trying to do things otherwise, and that's one of the ways in which I think we can work towards something more productive.
Danny, if I can ask, you gave us a great example. Where did that example come from? Did you see that in the academics that were teaching you as you were entering academia? Is that something that became important to you, that has always been important to you? Is that something you're teaching your students?
That's something that came as part of the process for me, part of the process of being in that collaborative space. I owe a lot to one collaborator in particular, a woman named Gudia Mary Jane Johnson, who is a fantastic woman knowledge holder from the Kluane First Nation, and conversations with her really transformed how I think in terms of collaborating in general, not just about glaciers, but the emphasis on process over product, the emphasis on listening, not just hearing, but actively listening and opening yourself up to the possibility that your interlocutor could change your mind. That sort of approach to knowledge creation is something that I owe to conversations with her. But again, also I should say, reading the work of Libran and others has been something that I've taken on since my graduate work as well. So yeah, I guess a couple of sources, but she comes to mind very quickly.
Thank you, Danny. Jen, do you want to weigh in here?
Sure. I am not a scientist, so I can't speak directly to, well, really the funding question. As more of a humanist, that isn't always something that's really at our fingertips in the same kind of way. But I think to try and just like generally talk about the question, which I agree with Danny is a good one, and you answered it really beautifully and said a lot of the same things that I would have said as well. It's really that, like, in kind of the spirit, yeah, again, of Max Braun, what are the questions that we're actually asking in our research? How do those questions get formed? What are the ways that questions can become thinkable, imaginable, not imaginable? Those are kind of the questions that I'm interested in my own work. Sort of what creates the bounds of realistic research, especially as a humanist, sort of commenting on scientific research or scientific data extraction often when it comes to ice and Indigenous peoples. So that is kind of like at the core of my inquiry about inquiry is who are we benefiting? Who are we working for? Especially when we're thinking about the lands that we're on, who are we working in concert with? Who is involved from the very beginning? And so those sorts of things, I think, will shape any grant, will shape any, piece of writing, any piece of scholarship, whether it's, in through the range, whether it's literary, whether it's more traditional academic work, et cetera. And I think often, funding institutions don't ask us as researchers to make those questions about our questioning central to how we get funded. So that's like more of a kind of conceptual meta answer, but really that urges us to think about the local first and the folks that we're working for and working with as some of the core tenets to the work that we're trying to do. And those are really hard questions if we think about them honestly, we think about them directly. They can be very tough ones to answer and contend with.
I love that from both of you, different points of view coming in on this, but really just trying to elevate the importance of that collaboration, that increased and constant different viewpoints that are part of an ongoing conversation about ice. When I was much younger, first starting out on my career, I would go out in the field to ice and it would just be a few people. And I would see the same few people, usually white, Western male, enacting some type of measuring, monitoring, predicting on glacier ice. And that has slowly changed over time. There are bigger teams, there are locals, there are different perspectives, different parts of career, all kinds of diversity, which gives me a lot of hope about the future of glaciological research. For either of you, Danny, Jen, how do you see the culture of scholarship? So, Jen, not just science, but scholarship. How is that changing? What trends do you see coming?
I think that it's a pretty exciting time to be thinking and writing and dreaming about ice, even though the kind of the tough realities of ice melt and ice change are very much true and real and urgent. And also, I think that the work of some organization and institutions and communities and climate justice work has never been more vibrant and crucial and needed, but always hardworking. Um, so I think maybe in like academic scholarship in particular, I think that there are a lot of really great like interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary conversations that are starting. There's a bunch of, edited collections and um, you know, journal collections coming out about ice humanities and all of these different ways to think about ice, to write about ice that are just as needed as the other. I think often when we think about glaciology or um, ice science, it is often science, right? That is what people think of. That was what comes to mind. That's what gets dreamt up about, the most appropriate way to think about ice and ice geographies. And I think that that's a really important part of the conversation that's changing now is that that isn't actually the only or most appropriate or best way to think about ice and especially ice change in the modern moment. So that feels really exciting to me. And the conversations that are happening across discipline, and that each sort of, I don't know, stakeholder, I guess I would say, doesn't is less interested in sort of digging in our heels about like, well, we have the most real way to assess ice change, ice futures, et cetera. And yeah, so I think that feels really exciting to me in this moment.
Thanks, Jen. Yeah. Danny, you want to answer that at all?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to take a pass. I just from what you're saying, Jen, I'm reminded of something that Mark Carey, who, ma'am, you have collaborated with, and he runs a glacier lab at the University of Oregon. This summer, we were having some chats, and one of the things he said to me that resonates with what you're saying there, Jen, is what if instead of thinking about ice as quantitative in the first instance, as water equivalent or water loss equivalent, we began by thinking of about ice as qualitative. So something that has qualities for particular groups of people who are engaged with it, and how does that change the starting point? I think that really resonates with what you're saying there, and I think it's a really good idea. But going back to the way you framed your question, Em, I can't help but fixate on your comment about the lone male glaciologist out there wrestling with the elements. As a historian of science, this is something that I've thought about. Historian of the field sciences, particularly. This is a sort of image that has a lot of clout in the history of the field sciences. And I think that things are changing. So if I think about how in my lifetime, even as late as 1987, females were not welcome in the field stations of the British Antarctic Survey, right? If I think about that and that change, along with some other changes that you can see in things like inspiring girls expeditions. So this is something that began in 2012 with glaciologist Erin Pettit, who I believe is also maybe a National Geographic explorer like yourself, Em. So she began by simply bringing what at the time was called Girls on Ice, so inviting young females to the glaciers and to envision themselves as glaciologists. That has grown immensely, both in its geographical scope and its gender scope. So girls, inspiring girls expeditions is now girls with an asterisk, right? So kind of any female identifying person, be they two-spirit, trans, whatever, are now included in most of the expeditions. It varies somewhat depending on where the expedition is, but there are now versions of that in Europe and in Canada and in the United States and all over the world. So seeing that grow is sort of another way in which I see that there are changes in the world of glaciological research, specifically along the gendered lines. And actually, just very recently in 2025, there was a piece in the Journal of Glaciology that was co-authored by members of the Carthouse Summer School of Glaciology, I believe it's called, something along those lines. And they were writing a piece about what they hope glaciology will look like in 50 years. And I was encouraged to see that, moving toward greater gender representation and representation of currently underrepresented folks in the world of glaciology was one of the things that they were calling for. And that in many respects, they echoed and expanded upon some things that you yourself, were calling for in 2016 with a very famous article that you co-authored with aforementioned Mark Carey and others. So I'm seeing positive trends in this direction. But I'm also mindful that, there's still work to be done here. Sexual harassment is an issue in field schools, as people are discussing right now. And of course, as you climb the professional ladder, more difficult barriers seem to present themselves to female scholars, particularly female scholars who choose to have children, right, or caregivers in some other way, which is still the case in our culture that females are often more often caregivers, and so forced to try to reconcile the requirements of caregiving with the requirements of the professional world. Anna Farrow Henderson's book, Core Samples, is a really fantastic sort of personal account of what that looks like in the earth sciences and in science policy and in government. And I highly recommend it as a read for anybody who's interested in sort of what it looks like to try and navigate some of the cultural, structural barriers still facing females. And highly recommend the section called How to Pee Standing Up, because that really gives you a sense of the mundaneness of some of the barriers still facing folks. But anyway, so I do think there's change in great directions, but
I'm reminded of a time when I was out on a glacier called Vatnajökull, which is in Iceland, and I was quite pregnant. And I was out with some media. And at the end, after they'd asked all the questions about the ice, they then asked me this very thoughtful question about what was it like to be on a glacier pregnant, carrying another generation, when this glacier that I had known for decades had just melted excessive amounts in the last couple of years. And it was just a thoughtful question. And I gave up what I thought was very thoughtful answer. But when the media ran later, what I was unprepared for is the feedback I got was never about what I'd actually said. The feedback instead was almost entirely zeroed in on how unsafe I must have been as a mother to be carrying a child in my physical body while out on the ice, which comes to all of these narratives of what women can and cannot do, what is safe, what is not safe. And it became quite a moment of learning for me about what I was willing to share. I want to build on that, but also I'm looking at some of these just really incredible audience questions. I wanted to ask this one of both of you. What drew each of you to study ice, to study glaciers? I love that question. It just gets right to it. Please, either of you. What's the core of this fascination? Danny?
love.
Yeah.
I simply love mountain landscapes. I love glaciated landscapes. And when I was doing my graduate work, I was initially doing a different project. I think it was a very good project, but I was miserable doing it. And at some point in my first year, when I was getting ready to quit, a senior scholar, very esteemed scholar in my field, was having a conversation with the graduate students. And he said, looking back on a very impressive career, if I could do it all again, I would study something I love. And it was like a light bulb for me at that moment. I realized, wait, this is the moment. This is the opportunity I have to shape my future and really study something I love. And I grew up in Western Canada, so there was a bit of homesickness at play there, I think, as well in that moment.
Yeah.
But what came to mind when I thought to myself, what do I truly really love? Those glaciated mountains of Western Canada, and home. So that's what got me into it. And then it just proved to be a fascinating and really wonderful place to work with great colleagues and lots of opportunities for interesting questions that has kept me there.
Yeah. Jen?
This is a good question. I think that it's the question, I guess I'll interpret it as like, how did you come to write a book about ice? It was not super intentional on my part, but though my sort of personal history is very much entangled with ice and glaciers and ice movement in Alaska as a Native person who was born and grew up in South Central coastal Alaska. And many of our histories and migration histories of my tribe are tied up with glaciers and glacier movement. So there's many ways that ice has always been shaping, questions, whether scholarly or personal, for me. I think, originally when I was a graduate student, I wrote my dissertation on Alaska Native politics. And being a graduate student was such a challenge, but also such a privilege to be able to think and write deeply about intellectual questions. And so having that time to really think about why Alaska Native politics look the way that they do in the contemporary moment, how they have come to be shaped over time, was the really some of the core questions of the dissertation. Why did we have the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act? Why don't we have reservations apart from one? And within trying to answer those questions in the dissertation, what I kept coming up against in archives and in history and news and literature was ice, was the way that ice has actually shaped many of those questions that I was asking in ways that I didn't anticipate at all. And so the book came to be written later about ice because I think, similar to Danny, it felt the most compelling, the most interesting thing to write about in a way to answer questions about race, racialization, land dispossession, Indigenous politics. It just kept coming back to these questions of ice. So I definitely didn't sit down and think like, oh, I'd love to write a book about ice. It definitely just came and really trying to puzzle out these questions about politics over the course of, a decade. So that's sort of a very circuitous route to thinking through ice in these ways.
Jen, every person I know who works with ice has got a story that circles, right? I don't think anyone is born, but they could be, that says the very first thing I want to do is be a glaciologist. I work with a lot of young people, and they always ask me this question. This is why I wanted to amplify it here is, how did you come to study ice and why? Danny, you're talking about love, right? Our careers, our lives are long. If we're going to study this thing, if we're going to work with it, it's hard if you pick something you don't love about, right? I wanted to work with something that made me feel alive. And I had no idea that if you study ice, you get to also write books. You also get to think about things. You also get to travel. We have glaciers in the US and in Canada and Alaska and the Arctic and Antarctica. We also have glaciers in Africa. We have glaciers in South America. We have glaciers in Central Asia and India and Japan. We have glaciers so many places worldwide with the exception of Australia yeah, Australia. And so thinking about all these different places and all these different stories, ice can bring so much, and there's so much we have to learn. How can you not love it? I want to transition us a little bit because I have the honor of being able to travel all over the world and talk about ice, and I usually get the same joke told to me. I say, I study ice, and someone says, you're going to be a historian soon. That just seems to be, I almost have to like fix my face to smile because I hear this joke so often. And so, of course, in that joke is implying that total glacier loss is happening. There's nothing anybody can do, and this is our expected future. So for Danny and for Jen, for both of you, I would love for you to speak on some of those risks of scholarly, political, personal, of continuing to frame glaciers as a single story of melt. What's going on there? What are those risks?
Would you like to go first, Jen?
Sure, yeah. I think for me, in thinking about the question, it's another really good one, is that the it's a very flippant way to speak about ice and to speak about glaciers. I think for me, and the way that that question lands on me, because I often get that comment or question to a variation of it. And so in my estimation, in my own study and in my own central interest is thinking about how Indigenous peoples, across affiliations, but also in very distinct ways, have relationships with ice and glaciers that understand ice as kin, as a relation. And so to speak of ice in that way, while it's not that it shouldn't, the urgency shouldn't be dismissed or undermined. The reality of ice change is valid. But to speak of ice change in that way, in that flippant way, to me is quite violent. And so in that way, I think there are careful ways there, but there's also, strategic ways that ice needs to be talked about. The urgency can't be lost, but also the urgency can't be the only way that we talk about change and loss and often devastation. Crisis, I don't think the language of crisis isn't hasn't helped us get to where we need to be in the ways that we're thinking that it is doing. So in that sense, part of the way that I wrote my book was to offer different ways to think about ice change in ways that doesn't force us as researchers, as thinkers, as writers, as intellectuals to only think about ice loss through destruction, through demise, through declension, because one of the arguments that I make is that this way of talking about ice loss is also very linked to how Indigenous peoples have been spoken about and understood, is also through this declensionist narrative. Um, I don't think it's new, a new request or a new thought to ask us as scholars or even as intellectuals to be careful with the language that we use, the way that we talk about people and places, and materiality and homeland. So in that sense, I think there are a whole host of ways, if we think deeply, if we think slowly and carefully, that we can talk about the realities of ice change that don't necessitate the kind of violence and prioritizing of loss as the only way that we can tell that story, or those stories rather.
Thanks, Jen. Danny?
Yeah, that's I would say that you've put so much more poignantly what I was thinking along those lines there, Jen. The framing as the declensionist framing of glaciers as, a foregone conclusion, there's a telos, they're going to disappear, you're going to be historian, which for what it's worth is a pretty good gig. So if you end up in our world, then you're welcome. But
I'll take that invite. Thanks.
Yeah. But it's, that framing, one of the problems with it is simply that's just so dominant, right? And that it makes it hard for other research programs and other research questions to get framed, right? This is true of all science, right? Science operates in ways in which, the framing of a research question or topic focuses attention in one area at the expense of others. And, the hope is that you can go back and fill in those gaps and take on those alternative research programs. But when your object of study is indeed transforming rapidly, those end up being what historian of science Robert Proctor calls a lost realm of knowledge, right? And so there's a scientific risk to focusing only on ice loss, right? And focusing on it as this sort of purely quantitative thing that needs to be measured above all else. And it makes it difficult, I think, to ask the kinds of questions and seek the stories that Jen is talking about, but that other scholars like I'm thinking about Karine Gagné at the University of Guelph, working with people in Ladakh to understand how the loss and recession of their local glaciers is understood by them as community members whose lives are intimately entwined with these glaciers. Or Hildegard Dienberger at the University of Cambridge, similar kind of thing for her team. They're trying to get an understanding of ice, working with people in eastern Nepal whose lives are shaped and in some cases violently shaken by glacier lake outburst floods, right? There's so many great research questions and stories to be told about glaciers and ice. that really bring it home in more locally specific ways that I think become harder to ask and hear when we're so focused on their disappearance and we've narrated it as a foregone conclusion. Um, and I think the sort of social and political risk beyond the scientific risk is, of course, that if we're saturating the discourse of glaciers with these images of loss, we run the risk of deadening people's responses and making them feel climate despair, and making it hard for them to see how they can be connected to these beautiful objects that sometimes seem very far away. And sometimes connecting is through understanding people who are more closely connected, right? So I think that that's some of the social and political risk that's involved there. It can lead to a sense of impotence regarding climate change. That's a real problem.
I spend a lot of my time, a lot of the books I've written, thinking about this idea of loss and the language we use, if loss is the defining characteristic of a glacier. When I was just learning, starting my graduate work, just learning science, I started to realize that the language we use for our landscapes is often rather similar to the language we use for how we relate to one another, the language of family. And when we think about when our families, when our lives have rupture, when we lose someone, does that loss of that individual then become the only thing we talk about for that person? And there's often so much more that we can bring to, that we can continue to learn new stories, new images, new interactions, new smells, all of those complexities of being that person that transcend loss. And that seems to be such a big jump to extend that to ice, to extend that to other things that we're seeing have different shapes today with increasing climate change. I really like the perspective both of you just brought to that. Thank you so much. That's why I love having a conversation like this, what we're learning together. Danny, I wanted to transition us just a little bit and thinking about your work and your book, Capturing Glaciers, A History of Repeat Photography and Global Warming. I was particularly fascinated reading through this book because I've worked with a lot of teams who do repeat photography, especially in Iceland. And with my colleagues at Niehamer, we made a repeat photography film called After Ice. And it chronicles a lot of the glaciers on the southeastern coast that are changing very quickly. And we use repeat photography to make this film. But what I found fascinating is that when we went to film festivals or we showed it at various things, the incredible range of the ways that repeat images of glaciers were interpreted. Some were looking at these images and just seeing that sadness of loss. Some were looking at these images and having incredible amounts of excitement, new landscapes, new places. And so I wanted to ask you, what should science communicators, what should scholars think about today when glacier images carry significantly different meanings to different audiences over time and space?
Mhm. Yeah, thanks for that question. I think so. What, two things I want to say. The point of the book is simply not that repeat photography of glaciers is bad or has to be done away with or something like that, right? But simply that its sort of dominance as a representational mode needs to be considered, and we need to think about it as something that people do and that has been achieved by different kinds of actors over time for different kinds of reasons and different contexts, right? So the historian looking at the scientists in this moment. Um, and so I think that, one of the things that is often taken for granted with repeat glacier photography is this idea that there's such compelling images that the ice speaks for itself. And I really want to push back against that idea, right? I want to show the work that's put into making these images. But another way of seeing how they don't speak for themselves is, as you have just pointed out, by attending to how people receive the images and how people interpret them according to what they bring to honestly the relationship, the communicative relationship that is established there when you either tell a story or you show an image to someone. And so when I think about science communication more broadly in this instance, what I think is that often the model that's offered to science communicators is a sort of diffusionary model, right? Scientists, you get the knowledge, you get as good a fact as you can, and then you put it out there, and it will disseminate into the public. And the sort of what a historian named Joshua Howe has called the forcing function of knowledge just takes over. And once people have the right information, they will do the sort of right act. They will act accordingly. But as people have shown, that is not a very good model of how science communication works. And instead, I think, ought to think about it in these sort of more relational terms, which pushes science communicators to give a little bit of thought to who their intended audiences are. What might they be bringing to this relationship? So for instance, like some communities, Indigenous communities, often in northern communities, might have reason to distrust scientists because of things that have happened in the recent past. How might we approach science communication in a way that recognizes this history, that seeks to build trust with these communities, that seeks to repair relations? Asking those kinds of questions as a part of science communication, I think, is an important way of thinking about it in relational terms. Being mindful of the fractured media landscape, which, I mean, frankly, the media landscape has been fractured, and people have been interpreting things according to their own contexts since mass media was a thing in the 19th century, right? Like there are great books about the reception of Darwin's Origin and how different audiences received that over time, in just the 19th century, right? And how, those receptions are shaped by context. But thinking about our own media landscape and the way in which it's fractured through deliberate mis and disinformation campaigns, through strategies that try to undermine legitimate attempts to communicate science, right? Being mindful of all of that, I think, is also an important element of science communication, to how we need to do science communication today, right? And it's, again, thinking about it in relational terms, aware of the context in which communication is attempting to happen, that I think really, really needs to happen if we're to.
I love that. Thank you for that reminder. That's so great. I'm going to actually pull a question from the audience here. Would love to hear stories from glaciers. Has there been a story of a glacier that's made you go, wow?
So many.
You want to take this one first, Jen? I'm still thinking.
Yeah,
We're looking for wow here.
Wow.
I don't know where to start exactly. I mean, I think that, like, one of the books that I'm sure most folks have heard of in the room, but I'll just pitch it again, is Julie Cruikshank's Do Glaciers Listen? I really am so fond of the way that she writes about glaciers and Indigenous understandings and expertise about glaciers, and the sociality of how glaciers shape thought and community. And so I just love that book because it's just chock full of answers to that question. And I mean, for me, actually, in my own experience about glaciers, part of my own desire is actually to make glaciers feel a little bit more pedestrian, is to make glaciers, to add an understanding, maybe add isn't the right word, but to sort of place an understanding that for many peoples in the world, glaciers are an everyday occurrence, are something that's well understood, well traveled, often seen, often interacted with, understood as a relation. And so to actually maybe like pierce the wow a little bit is part of my hope as well. That's not the only way that glaciers need to be seen in order to be understood as important and valid and kind of the anti-spectacle, right? We also need that perspective. So I'll say both of those things.
Perfect. Danny, anything from you?
Yes, I was also thinking about Julie Cruikshank's book in that moment, Jen, and trying to think about, okay, now which of the stories that she told really got me, because that was one of the early inspirations for me too. And the Castine story, which I don't want to give a whole lot of details for because I'm afraid that I'm going to screw them up. But she relates a story about a woman named Castine that's in Tlingit culture that has to do with singing to the glacier and bringing the glacier down through either singing or playing of a flute, I believe it is. That story really got me. And so I highly recommend people picking up that book and finding that story.
The book Danny is talking about is Julie Cruikshank's Do Glaciers Listen, and it's a must read for anyone
Mhm.
who wants to learn a little bit about how amazing our world is. I will say that Jen, I'm hearing what you're saying about deflating the wow a little bit, but I got the opportunity to stand on a glacier when we had northern lights above us and watch the ice take that out of the sky, the color, and dance it within itself. And to see that gave me every possible wow. I never knew something like that was possible. Uh, I love it. I'm going to ask a couple of other questions that are coming up from our audience chat. Um, this is a big one, but I think it might be one to think about. Um, what can we do to further amplify glaciers? How do we work to support ice preservation? Big
Wow, that
question.
is a very big question.
Yeah,
The answer will be different for everyone given
yeah,
what their capacities are.
yeah.
But I mean, you know, I think the thing to note is, of course, that it is well established that glaciers are melting at an accelerated rate because of anthropogenic climate change. And so one of the ways in which we amplify or preserve or try to treat well glaciers is by acting in ways that combat anthropogenic climate change, whether that be through the ways in which we engage in politics and voting mechanisms to daily choices in our individual lives. Um, it's such a big question. And I think that sometimes we get stymied because it feels so impossible to address. And I really want to push back against feeling like just because you can't do it all, don't do anything, right? Little things, orient yourself in a way, in a good way that can make a difference. Um, so yeah, thinking about what contributes to our carbon footprints, thinking about our role as um, you know, citizens in global northern sort of affluent countries, and how the ways that we live have effects on global ice, right? Asking
Mhm.
ourselves, how can we in our daily lives and in our political lives push against these trends is, I think, the way to amplify glaciers. There's lots of things that people are doing to try and preserve glaciers like locally, right? You think about
Yeah.
glacier blanketing and all that kind of stuff, but most of us aren't in a position to be laying blankets on glaciers in the summertime, right? So then the question is, what can we do? And it will differ for everybody, but I think asking ourselves those questions is a good starting point.
Isn't that exciting though? If that question is different and that answer is different for so many different people, they can find themselves in there.
There you
There
go.
isn't a single way forward. You can walk in. You can do what you care about, what you love, and you can also work with ice. Jen, do you have an answer here?
Yeah, it's a big question. I wonder how you answer this question, Em. I feel like you probably get it a
I
lot.
do. I get it a lot. Yeah.
What are the ways that you find a way into answering that?
You know, when I first started working with the geographic decades ago, the motto at the time was with knowing comes caring, and with caring comes hope. And that has stuck with me all these years since, because I spend a lot of my time encouraging people. I can I can pivot just about any conversation I'm having into glaciers, just glaciers and cats. Those are my two topics, right? And I keep thinking that the more I'm talking about glaciers, talking about stories, talking about ice in all of these different places, the more it still stays front of space in the global consciousness. And this is why I spend so much of my time writing books, doing film and television, accepting any invitation to speak just about anywhere about ice, because that's what's important to me. right? Is that continuing that conversation. And I just have to echo what Danny said, because I think that it's incredibly profound. It does not matter what you do or what your background is. You don't have to be a glaciologist, but you can think about ice, learn about your ice, learn about how other people interact with ice, and then talk about it. Have those holiday family conversations all about glaciers. Go to a party. You'll instantly make friends if you're talking about glaciers. That's what we need to do, because then we think more about them. We value them differently. We understand the diversity and plasticity of them. Jen, anything you want to add before I go to a different audience question?
Um, I think given these were great answers that you both gave. I think part of the work that I'm hopeful and am doing is to show the way that glaciers are really tied to the political, that they're not something far off and far flung. So I think that and it might not sound like it makes sense immediately, but I think some of the ways we can care about ice or think about like some of the most endangered people and folks and places in your community and lending yourself to their service is also about protecting ice glaciers, ice geographies. So I'll just say that.
Yeah. Another question from the audience. What's the future here for working with glaciers?
I wish I knew better what the intended sort of subject of that question was. Future
Yeah.
for whom is kind
Yeah.
of the follow-up I want there. I guess that gives us leeway, doesn't it, Jen, to sort of pick that up. It seems to me like the trends are moving in the ways that we've been discussing here into sort of amplifying the diversity of stories that are told about ice and the ways that we understand it as intimately connected with daily life of all types of people in all kinds of ways, and in specific, sort of acute ways for particular individuals and communities that you, Jen, invite us to rightly, I think, consider more when we think about ice. So I think that's sort of where we're going. I think interdisciplinary collaboration is going to continue to be an absolute necessity, and I think an invitation of collaboration beyond sort of standard academic circles, to include people for whom ice is sort of most intimately part of their daily life and who stand to benefit the most from the production of knowledge about ice is another feature of what the future is going to look like for glacier and ice research. And that is my great hope, at
I
least.
love that. What's the future? And then we're defining our hope, right? What that might look like. A question along those lines, where do we see glimmers of hope in approaching ice and glaciers through the arts and the humanities? Jen, do you want to take a swing at that question? Any glimmers of hope that you're seeing?
Um, it's a tough question. It's a good one. It's a tough one for me because I think there's always been ways to think about ice and relate to ice, longstanding over time, that have been continually relational and productive and generative. And so to kind of pin so much in our modern moment on the sort of the of hope, I am a little bit, there's some skepticism there for me around the politics of hope, what that does and who it's for. Um, so I think there's always been hope, right? It's always been living and moving and acting. And so I think maybe I would say that there, for me, is less of an impetus to invent new ways to hope and to learn about the ways that have already been hopeful over time. That there is less that we need to do sort of on the individual level and more about the ways that we show up for community and learn about how particular people have been in constant hopeful relationships with ice over time, historically and ongoing.
Jen, can you unpack that a little bit more? As opposed to inventing new ways of hope, you're talking about the ways we have been hoping already.
The ways that people have been hopeful. Yeah, I don't want to propose that there's a sort of universal or generalized way that we can all hope in the same way or experience hope. But there are long-standing and ongoing relationships to ice that sort of precede the question of hope, the contemporary question of hope. And so that for me feels like an important place for learning and for educating ourselves and to better understand the current moment and why we feel compelled and called for new forms of hope.
Mm-hmm. Danny, anything you want to add in there?
No, I think that's a really fabulous answer, Jen. And I think that for me, you're reminding me of Kyle Powys-White's essay about climate change as colonial deja vu for Indigenous peoples, and how like this, speaking not of hope, but speaking of like alarmism, right? There's this culture of alarmism that we see with climate change. And his argument there is that this is the reality that a lot of peoples have lived with for some time in terms of, a violent environment and homeland shaping catastrophe that's always kind of present. And so then the question, like you say, Jen, becomes what, who is it for? Who is the hope for? Who is the catastrophe for? And who have been living with other ways of being hopeful or being under extreme pressure in these ways already. So that's something that came to mind when you were saying that.
I remember very strongly when I was just a brand new grad student going out to the field for the first time with my list of questions that I'd come out with, right? And the big one was like, how sad are you about climate change and glacier change, right? Single question. And then that first couple weeks, realizing I had presupposed my question, my answer, all of this. I was doing this incorrectly. And then that email, that awkward email to my advisor saying I have to start over because there are so many different ways to hope, to experience catastrophe, to have all of these different stories of living with an environment alongside and within an environment that is constantly changing. And glaciers really bring that to fore. A glacier environment is currently in a state of change. That's what the glacier environment is. It's always shifting. It's always changing. And so to be able to learn to live with that continuous shift, that's part of what glaciers can teach us, is when you don't have to believe that everything is the same and will always be the same, but it continuously changes. I know we're just about out of time. Any last thoughts from either of you?
Just thanks for everyone that joined, and thanks, Em, for moderating, and thank you, Danny, for the great conversation, and to the folks at the Institute for organizing.
Okay. Danny, any last glacier thoughts, conversation thoughts from you?
I have so many thoughts, but we have 2 minutes.
We have 1 minute. I'd love to hear those thoughts.
It's hard to know which thoughts to poke on. Yeah, I guess I want to say that I'm delighted to have been part of this, and I take the fact that we were invited to speak on this matter as a sign of things that have shifted in the way that we speak about glaciers from even say the 1990s, and that I think that these shifts are in general moving in good directions. And so for my part, I'm very happy to have been part of this, and I thank you both.
Thank you. Yeah.
It's been a
Thank
lovely
you so much for
conversation.
that. I'm keeping an eye on time, so I just want to say that this is concluding our program for today. I want to thank Danny and Jen for their just terrific conversation and the perspectives that they brought, and all the thoughtful questions from the audience. So the second installation in Radcliffe's two-part virtual series on ice humanities will take place on Monday, February 2nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. It's titled Inspired by Ice. And the program will explore the evocative power of art to help us understand the impacts of climate change on Arctic communities. For more information, register, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Finally, today's program has been recorded. It will be posted in about a week, I think. For more information about other upcoming Radcliffe programs and to see videos of past events, please visit the Radcliffe website. Thank you again for joining us today, and please take care.